Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our 2022 Kickoff event for the Big Read Lakeshore. We are very excited to explore the topic of Greek mythology with all of you tonight, and are very grateful that you are spending your evening with us. I am Addie Wilcox, a sophomore at Hope College and an intern for the Big Read. I am majoring in secondary English education, creative writing, and classical studies. Our Big Read book this year is Circe by Madeline Miller, and our Little Read book is Last Stop on Market Street by Matt de la Peña. The middle read books are Homer's Odyssey, Superman Dawnbreaker by Matt de la Peña, Zeta the Space Girl by Ben Hatke, and Miles Morales, Spaceman by Jason Reynolds. All of these books explore the hero's journey in some way and ask readers to think about what it means to be a hero in different times, places, and cultures. Our goal this year with Circe is to meet our readers wherever they are with Greek mythology, whether that be a novice or veteran readers. We've designed our program to help our participants better understand, experience, and hopefully appreciate Greek mythology. Joining us tonight, we have Hope's Interim Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Stephen Maiullo. Dr. Maiullo has his PhD in Classics from Ohio State University and has been a professor at Hope College since 2010. His area of expertise is in Greek literature, Greek and Roman philosophy, and reception of classical literature. He teaches Latin and Greek language courses, classes that focus on the literature of the classical world, and general education courses on topics such as classical mythology and the history of Rome. Tonight, Dr. Maiullo will be talking about classical mythology in general, what it is, how it works, and why modern adaptations have just as much of a claim for being part of the tradition as the originals. He will also address some of the themes in the Odyssey and how Madeline Miller adapts them in her book. There will be a Q&A immediately following Dr. Maiullo's lecture, and we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions about the book and Greek mythology. Before I turn over the mic to Dr. Maiullo, I want to say thanks to our sponsors for this event, Sight Eye Clinic. We couldn't put on a community-wide reading program like this without the support of our partners and local businesses. Sight Eye Clinic is one of these amazing businesses, and we thank them for their investment in our community through this sponsorship. We're grateful for their willingness to help us foster a culture where reading matters. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Maiullo.
All right, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. 1 second. There we go. Right. This is Google Slides. I'm not so good with the... Oh, wait a minute. That's the wrong slide. Go back up to the beginning. All right. There we go. Ready to start. Good. Good way to start. This thing is totally in my way. Can't see. All right. So I took my first mythology class 20 years ago in 2002 during my senior year of college. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in the cafeteria, and I was reading Richmond Lattimore's translation of Homer's Odyssey. Then someone I had met the night before, I'll never forget her name because she shared a name with a famous actor, Natalie Wood, came up to me and asked, "What are you reading?" I said, "It's Homer's Odyssey. It's for my myth class. I need it for my classics major." Natalie had been taking Latin, so she knew what a classics major was, thankfully. But she wondered aloud, a classics major? What are you going to do with that? I was used to that question. I got it all the time from family, friends, neighbors, everybody. I felt the dogs barking out their indignation as I walked down the street. I had a standard response, and it was classics majors do pretty much everything that anybody else does. They become middle school principals and practice law, and they teach, and they become computer programmers. If they have the right bio and chem classes, they become doctors. They go to med school. I like this to read these texts because I think it raises some important questions about living a human life. And Natalie said, "Well, like what?" At 21, I didn't have a really good answer to that question, or really any answer to that question. But I knew eventually something in these texts would make sense to me. So I answered, I don't know, but I'll let you know when I figure it out. So bear with me, because for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you some of the things I wish I had said to Natalie 20 years ago. So in this talk, I'm going to do 3 things. Oh no, it's already on the slide. Okay, here we go. First, I'm going to define myth, so that way you know what it is. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about whether ancient myths can have value for us today. Then I'm going to take some test case moments from scenes in Circe to talk about some of the myths that are in there. And then I'll conclude with a broad discussion of some of the things to be thinking about as you read Circe if you haven't read it already. And if you have read it, maybe I can pull together some things that you might be thinking about. So let's start with defining myth. When I was doing my graduate studies at Ohio State, I became a teaching assistant for a mythology course, and I studied with this man here, who wrote the literal book on mythology. That's his book. It's called Greek Mythology, an introduction. His name is Fritz Graf, and he has helped a generation of scholars think about Greek mythology and religion. It's one of those books that's been translated into many different languages, and English is not the language that he wrote it in. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to sound very smart about myth, but that's only because I'm summarizing Fritz. Here's what he says. He says that a myth is a traditional story. And he goes on to unpack what that means. To say that a myth is a story means that there is a storyteller of some kind. And that storyteller may do so in many different genres or artistic forms. They can come in the forms of songs or plays or poems. Myths can appear in all different kinds of media too: music, art, dance, theater, film, and of course novels. Myths give material to the fine arts, which by their very nature seek to enrich our spirits and make us glad to be alive. That a myth is traditional means that the stories get handed down from generation to generation. Each generation will receive it, but it doesn't come in a fixed form. Everyone who receives it has the freedom to change it to suit their concerns and their interests. That is, there are no fixed versions of any of these myths. No one knows where they came from, and we have the power to decide where they go when we receive it. Let me give you an example. That's pretty broad. So let me talk about the Iliad. This is traditionally seen as the first work of literature written in the Western world. If it is written at all, it's part of oral tradition. There's excellent evidence that the very first poem in the so-called Western tradition, the Iliad, represents a story that has been handed down from earlier generations, and that this version was changed from something else. How do I know that? Well, the Iliad is strange. It's a poem about the Trojan War. That is, the Greek heroes are fighting against the Trojans because a Trojan prince named Paris stole one of the Greek king's wives. Stole her. We'd expect this story to be an epic tale about how the greatest Greek heroes won their bloody but heroic victory over the Trojans, right? We'd expect to hear how Achilles arrived on the beach at Troy in order to go behind enemy lines, cut down the enemy to escape, to rescue and help Helen escape and bring her back to safety and make those Trojans pay for their crimes. Sort of a mythical and Greek version of Saving Private Ryan on D-Day. Interestingly enough, Stanley Lombardo's translation chooses D-Day as the cover. But no, that's not the story we get. We get the unexpected. Here's Stanley Lombardo's translation of the opening lines of the Iliad. Rage. Sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that costs the Greeks incalculable pain. Note this opening. Achilles' rage is black and murderous. But it's not costing the Greeks, it's not costing the Trojans incalculable pain. It's costing the Greeks pain. We'd expect the great Greek epic about the greatest Greek hero, Achilles, to be about how Achilles was kicking butt and taking names from the Trojans. It's not about that. This poem starts at the end of the war, when everybody is fed up and frustrated. The Greeks have been there a decade, and they haven't made any progress at all. In fact, the poem only depicts 40 days, and it starts with a dispute between the greatest hero, Achilles, and his leader, Agamemnon. This is a new story. It's a story about how the search for individual glory and honor in battle is destructive, not something to be valued, destructive to everyone who participates in this enterprise. It's a poem about how rage and anger can be self-destructive to us all. So when we are angry and when we hold on to that anger and nurse that anger, how do we hurt ourselves and the people that we love? Is at the center of this question. I think these questions still matter for us today. Let me give you an example. I had a really good friend growing up. His name was Anthony Del Preti. We called him Deli because of Del Preti, but also, fortuitously, his dad owned a deli, and that's not a joke. He sold Italian cold cuts and crusty bread, which people from East Boston called Spuckies for some reason. They're not called Spuckies anywhere else on the planet, to my knowledge. Anyway, we hung around together all the time. We played baseball and stickball in the alleys of East Boston. We rode bikes and played Nintendo and get into all kinds of trouble together. Got suspended from school a couple of times, the normal stuff. Anyway, just before I graduated high school, or we graduated high school, he said something that bothered me. It was an offhanded comment, and I cannot remember it now. I don't know what it was, genuinely. But we went to different colleges, and we lost touch. We didn't talk together for over a year. When we tried to reconnect, it wasn't the same at all. And I still haven't talked to him to this day, right? You think about the losses that you incur when you hold on to things like anger. This is what the Iliad is about. So the reason that people tell and retell myths is because they are relevant to the people who tell them and the people that they tell them to. Fritz Graf tells us that myths must change to remain culturally relevant, to retain any meaning at all. So, when we look at all of these different images up here, these are all representations of Odysseus or the Odyssey story in some way. The movie, the animated movie down there, I was watching that with my son one day. That's Bolt. And the girl's name is Penny, which is Penelope, who's Odysseus' wife. It's a story about the dog getting separated from Penny and trying to return home. It's the Odyssey. All of these stories. And then I don't know if you recognize, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, down there. But that's also the Odyssey. There's all these various Odysseus's and Ulysseses that come together, but they're different representations. They're looking at different aspects of the story, but they are all the same character, and they all share some familiar features and characteristics that make them recognizable, like a name or some other part of their narrative. But they are translated and transformed across cultures and across times. This is what myths do. If a myth is to be a myth, by definition, that myth must matter to somebody. If that myth stops mattering, then it's no longer a myth. It's just a story from thousands of years ago that collects dust on a shelf. Myths are alive and they are in motion. All this is to say that Madeline Miller's Odysseus and Circe is as important as Homer's Odysseus and the Odyssey. In fact, her Odysseus is even more important than Homer's Odysseus, because her Odysseus is speaking to the concerns of us, the modern audience living in this world. And when I read her Odysseus, I love him much more than I love Homer's Odysseus, because I recognize that man. I know that man. When I read her Circe, I connect with her. I see the experience of women in the world mapped onto her. And I hope I come closer to understanding parts of their experience. Madeline Miller is a myth maker. Let's take one of the stranger episodes in Miller's novel. It didn't strike me as strange, but my wife Grace asked me about it when she read the book, which made me realize how strange the myth actually is. So in chapters 9 to 11 of the book, Circe leaves the island of Aiaia, where she has been imprisoned after learning that she has the skills of witchcraft. She can transform men into gods and gods into monsters. This scares all the gods, and so they hide her away on this island. Her father, the sun, watches over her as he makes his journey across the sky every day, but she gets to leave because she has to help her sister, Pasiphae, give birth. Why Circe and not some other midwife or healer? Because Pasiphae was pregnant with a monster. And if anyone can heal Pasiphae and maybe transform the monster that she's carrying, it's Circe. Here's how the traditional myth goes. You can read about it in a number of places. I'm going to draw my version from the way Barry Powell describes it in his classical mythology textbook, which I read 20 years ago. Okay. Circe's sister, Pasiphae, marries Minos, a king of a powerful city in Crete. Minos was very proud to be king of this place because it was beautiful, it was peaceful, and it was home to the world's best architect, craftsman, engineer, and artist named Daedalus. One day, Minos is looking at all that he has, he has this beautiful immortal wife, Pasiphae. He has a number of beautiful children. He has a magnificent palace. His architect and engineer is building incredible wonders. He looks out at the sea and says, "The gods have blessed me. Poseidon, god of the sea, if you look favorably upon my rule and my kingdom, may a bull rise up from the sea, and I will sacrifice this bull to you." It's a strange story, but it gets stranger. Madeline Miller describes the rest. I'm pulling this from her book. Daedalus is speaking here. The gods sent a bull, pure white, to bless the kingdom of Minos. The queen admired the creature and desired to see it more closely. Yet it ran from anyone who came near. So I built the hollow likeness of a cow with a place inside for her to sit. I gave it wheels so we might roll it to the beach where the creature slept. I thought it would only be, I did not. Pasiphae cuts him off here, chastising him for taking too long with this story. Long story short, Daedalus built this contraption in order to allow Pasiphae to mate with this bull. And born from this union was a half-man, half-bull creation that would sow destruction for mankind. Daedalus wondered, can it be killed? And Circe, who was blessed with the gift of prophecy, knew the answer. The creature was mortal, but it would not die an infant. It had a fate many years in the future, and it must live it out. Until then, it could only be contained. So Daedalus builds a complex maze called a labyrinth, and anyone who went in couldn't get out, and neither could the bull, or the Minotaur, which is what this creature was called. He'd be kept in the middle of the maze, but once a year, he would have to eat human flesh, 7 boys and 7 girls. What's the point of this myth? There are a number of ways to understand it. For one, this is what the archaeological remains of Knossos look like, the place where Minos lived. One can see here a complex series of rooms around a center courtyard. They look like a maze. And the centerpiece there looks like a place where maybe a creature could be held. In fact, that's not what it was, but one possible explanation is the Greeks looked around and saw these remains and said, I wonder what was here. Greeks are trying to make sense of their own history, perhaps. But why keep telling this story? A couple of ways to think about it. One, the monster, the Minotaur, was born from a terrible transgression. Might this myth somehow be trying to represent in story that human beings feel and experience hidden and dangerous desires? Another possibility. Given that Daedalus's engineering can be used to imprison the Minotaur, might the myth be asking us to consider whether art, engineering, and culture can help us control and tame our more animalistic desires? Can there be an environmental reading? Human beings, by their very nature, tend to dominate whatever space they find themselves in. We domesticate animals, we breed them for their milk or their meat. We're not satisfied with that. We throw them in giant concentrated animal feeding operations called CAFOs, where we imprison them. But no matter what we do to nature, to tame nature, we can't stop her. We can only contain her. One day the sun will turn into a red giant and devour the earth, killing us all. All these readings are possible. Different storytellers may emphasize different parts of this narrative. In Miller's telling, though, Daedalus does all the talking, or most of it. He's trying to soften this story. He talks in euphemisms, downplaying Pasiphae's transgressions. For Daedalus, Pasiphae is just curious about the bull. She wants to see it up close. But the bull won't let any human beings near it, so Daedalus builds this cow so Pasiphae can climb in to get a closer look. Daedalus pauses, he stammers, he stumbles. He doesn't want to continue with the story. Why is Daedalus pausing and downplaying it? Well, I think he's trying to make it seem a little bit less bad, for sure, but as the rest of the chapter suggests, Daedalus isn't ashamed of what Pasiphae did as much as how his engineering, his design, his scientific curiosity about this incredible bull has unleashed something monstrous in the world. Daedalus is a kind of scientist or engineer, motivated by genuine curiosity. But then he has to watch someone use that technology for deeply destructive ends. For Miller, Daedalus's invention is misused. He could not foresee all the evil that would be unleashed from that invention. Let's think about the modern world for a moment. Consider what the early developers and potential adopters of the internet had in mind. They thought that quick access to knowledge might help the democratic exchange of ideas. It would give a platform to more people to share diverse perspectives without intervention from corporate or moneyed interests. They never would have imagined how it works today, that while you connect on social media, companies like Facebook and Google harvest all your data and sell it to advertisers. You create the content, and you are the product. Think about how, when you're searching, if thinking about younger people here in the audience, when you're looking on your social media accounts, the dopamine hits that come from likes, views, or even just doom scrolling, they bring us pleasure, but in the long run contribute to an increase in depression and anxiety that members of this audience feel. Once you start down a technological path, you can't get off of it. The myth of Pasiphae, Daedalus, and the Minotaur ask us to think about how technology facilitates the satisfaction of our deepest, darkest desires and the irreversible consequences of satisfying them. Maybe they can be contained, but never fully. We always have to sacrifice someone, usually the young, as a result of it. That's one way to read the Minotaur myth. And I think that's part of what Madeline Miller wants us to think about here. But let's zoom out a little further and look at what Madeline Miller specifically is doing with Homer's Odyssey more broadly. We can explore why she might be doing this a little bit too. So Circe is a character who appears in the 10th book of the Odyssey when Odysseus is on his travels back to Ithaca after the Trojan War. And when Odysseus and his men land on the island of Aiaia, where Circe lives, Odysseus climbs up to a high point on the shore. He looks down and sees smoke rising from Circe's house. When he returns to his men, he tells them that he wants them to explore the island, and they are not excited about it. They actually burst into tears. They just had a bunch of friends eaten alive by a giant cyclops with one eye that was eating them. But Odysseus is a curious man, and he has to see what's going on. So they draw lots. Half will explore the island, half will stay behind. Of those men, one, Eurylochus, he suspects a trap, so he hangs back. He runs back and tells Odysseus everything he saw. Here's what it says. Circe led them, that is the men, into her house and seated them. She brewed up a potion of wine with cheese and barley and pale honey stirred in. She laced this potion with insidious drugs that would make them forget their own native land. When they had eaten and drunk, she struck them with her wand and herded them into the sties outside. Grunting, their bodies were covered in bristles. They looked just like pigs, but their minds were intact. Once in pens, they squealed with dismay, and Circe threw them acorns and berries, the usual fare for wallowing swine. Odysseus then sets out to rescue his men. And on his way, he meets Hermes, who gives him an herb called moly that will render Circe's spells ineffective. He also gives him explicit instructions about what to do next. And here is what Hermes tells him. When Circe strikes you with her magic wand, draw your sharp sword from beside your thigh and rush at her with murder in your eye. She will be afraid and invite you to bed. Don't turn her down. That's how you'll get your comrades freed and yourself well loved. Odysseus follows this advice to the letter. He goes to Circe's house. She offers him the wine. She strikes him with her wand, and poof, nothing happens. He draws his sword, lunged at her with murder in his eye, and then the goddess shrieked, running beneath my blade, grabbed my knees and said to me, wailing, "Who are you and where do you come from? What is your city and who are your parents? I'm amazed that you drank this potion and are not bewitched. No other man has ever resisted this drug once it's passed his lips. But you have a mind that cannot be beguiled. You must be Odysseus, a man of many wiles. Well then, sheathe your sword and let's climb into my bed and tangle in love there so we may come to trust each other." After this incident, the scary witch Circe becomes helpful. Odysseus stays with her for a year, a full year, And as he's leaving, she gives him advice about how to avoid certain things on his way home. She turns into a helpful maiden. Feminist readers of the Odyssey find all this imagery about pulling out one sword and then lunging at women in a threatening manner to subdue them into helping you a bit difficult to deal with, I'd say. My female students don't love it either. When I first taught my myth class here at Hope in 2011, one of my students, her name was Rada, she came up to me after class. She loved reading the Odyssey. In fact, she loved Stanley Lombardo's translation. She thought it moved and it was exciting. But she said something like this to me. She said, at the beginning of the semester, you told me that Greek mythology, if it was a myth, was supposed to be relevant to the modern audience. I'm not sure I believe any of this. I don't believe that Circe would have this reaction. And if she did, I don't get the idea of let's go to bed together so we can learn to trust one another. That seems to be out of order, is what she said to me, the wrong order. I didn't press her for any more details, but I knew what she meant. I shared with her what feminist scholars like Froma Zeitlund have said about women infidelity in the Odyssey, and essentially what they say is, this is male wish. This is how men wished women would be. They can go out and spend a year sleeping with a beautiful goddess named Circe while their wives are at home weaving and unweaving a tapestry, just waiting dutifully for the husband to arrive. Well, I think Rada felt let down there wasn't much for her in this poem, at least not at this moment. And I wish that I had Madeline Miller in 2002 and 2011 when I was talking with Natalie and Rada. Because Miller points out this scene specifically in her novel. And it's probably my favorite part of the novel. I quote it all the time. I'm going to read it for you. This is Circe talking, and she says, later, years later, I would hear a song made of our meeting, referring to Homer's Odyssey. The boy who sang it was unskilled, missing notes more often than he hit. Yet the sweet music of the verses shone through his mangling. I was not surprised by the portrait of myself, the proud witch undone before the hero's sword, kneeling and begging for mercy. Humbling women seems to me a chief pastime of poets. And if there can be no story, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep. And there it is. Miller is irreverent about Homer in all the best ways. She's going to engage in some myth-making of her own, where the experience of the female and those on the fringes receive a central focus rather than a peripheral glance. Miller is making the story relevant for women or for anyone who has felt like they don't belong. I'll try not to spoil too much about the novel, in case you haven't read it yet, so I'll speak in some generalities. In the novel, we get Circe's backstory. She's born to a minor goddess in the sun, Helios. Her parents aren't satisfied with her, so her mother says to her father, come now, let's make a better one. She knows, that is, Circe knows that she is immortal, but she can't shoot fire from her eyes like her father can. She has a thin voice, more like a mortal's than a goddess's. Right from the start, she lives in a liminal space. A goddess who can't do all the things that goddesses do. She speaks like a mortal, but she's not one of them either. When I see that, I'm hooked right away. That's drawing me right in. Because her story is very much one of self-discovery. She discovers that she cares about human beings much more than any of the other gods do. In fact, she's troubled by how trivially the gods treat human life. Her father seemed to delight in being responsible for the murder of astronomers in king's courts, and he would deliberately make the sun slow so that way kings would hold astronomers accountable. As this is happening, Circe says she has a funny feeling in her stomach that it isn't quite right. She meets her uncle Prometheus, who's in the process of being whipped and tortured for stealing fire and giving it to help mortals. And as he's being whipped and tortured, she visits him and brings him comfort. Circe is empathetic to those who suffer, very different from this witch that's just turning men into pigs. We learn, too, that she has to make her own way in the world. Nothing comes to her easily. She makes mistakes. She's punished. She keeps fighting. She discovers that she's a witch. But she has to work at it, too. When she talks about sorcery, she says it's not like a divine power. It has to come through practice and hard work. She has to search for things, dig them up, chop them up, grind them, cook them, sing over them, chant over them. After all that, it still might not work. The gods can just make things happen. Witchcraft isn't like that. Witchcraft, she says, is drudgery. Each herb must be found in its den, harvested at the right time, grubbed from the dirt, culled and stripped, washed and prepared. It must be handled this way, then that, to find out where its power lies. Day upon patient day, you must throw out your errors and begin again. So why did I not mind, she asks. In Miller's hands, Circe is living her own story. She's not just there to help Odysseus along the way. She's on her own path of discovery. And she's not so much a witch as she is a scientist. She's performing experiments of all kinds, noting the results, ensuring that those results are reproducible. She's developing healing technologies. It's no wonder why she loved Daedalus so much. We also learn why she turns the sailors who visit her into pigs. I'll leave you to read this very powerful section on your own, but let's say Circe is defending herself. The sailors come to her island and they assault her. She is not a witch who seeks to harm mortals. She is a goddess trying to protect herself. In her encounter with Odysseus, that comes in a pivotal moment in Circe's own story. After her trauma, Odysseus shows her that she can trust mortals again, but not by climbing into bed with them first, by talking, building trust, and then becoming lovers. As Circe comes to know about Odysseus, his struggles in war and at sea, she comes to understand why she loves mortals so much. Note this scene. Circe is thinking about Odysseus, and she says, she watches him. I watched the pain passing over his face. Now it hurt, and now still it hurt, and now, and now. And that was only one among his discomforts, stiff neck, an acid stomach, and the ache of old wounds. I ran my hands over his rib scars, easing them as I could. The scars themselves I offered to wipe away. He shook his head. How would I know myself? I was secretly glad they suited him. Enduring Odysseus he was, and the name was stitched into his skin. Whoever saw him must salute and say, there is a man who has seen the world. There is a captain with stories to tell. Miller turns Circe into a different kind of hero, not one where war and adventure is at the center, but one where coming to self-knowledge and self-confidence is. Circe, like Odysseus, is a survivor. Her most epic moment in the novel is childbirth. You should read the childbirth chapter. It's incredible. And raising a son as a single mother. And eventually, having to let him go to lead his own life. When she's looking at Odysseus and the story that's stitched into his skin, she realizes what she's missing as a goddess, as an immortal. So to conclude, I want you to imagine yourself as Odysseus. Everybody in this room, by virtue of being human, has scars. Physical scars, emotional scars. A beautiful goddess, or god, comes to you and offers to wipe them all away. All your pain, all your suffering, all the things that mark your humanity. Do you accept? What if the same goddess offers to give you a drug that will make you immortal? You will never age, you will never die. I'm not talking about cosmetic tucks and lifts here. I'm talking about living forever and forever young. Do you take that? If this sounds like a far-fetched question, it is not. Some of the richest people on the planet are investing heavily in science and technology to expand our lifespan, to understand where aging takes place in your human cells and to try to stop it. There are other programs that are trying to map the human brain, the goal of which is to copy everything that is in your brain, all your neuronal connections, to try to copy every experience that you've ever had, every memory that you've ever had, every single thing that you've ever experienced, copied to be uploaded to a file somewhere to be downloaded later, maybe by your great-grandchildren, maybe to beam you across to the moon, who knows? We're reminded here of Daedalus's cow contraption and the destruction that this technology might bring into the world. What you need to know about Circe, Madeline Miller's hero, is she chooses mortality. Because for her, the finiteness, the fragility that comes with human life is its meaning. Anyone can love someone when they are young and beautiful. That is not hard. We test our love and grow stronger in it as we share our lives with somebody, as we age. With our partners when times are good and when times are not so good. When we age and gravity takes over, when your loved ones become ill, when you stay with them by their side as they die. That, for Miller, for Circe, is where love is truly found. See, for Miller and Circe, immortality is death. Circe says at the end of the novel, I thought once that the gods are the opposite of death, but I see now that they are more dead than anything, for they are unchanging and can hold nothing in their hands. A myth is a traditional story that is handed down and changes. What is Madeline Miller saying with this novel? She's giving voice to characters that have been traditionally excluded, but there's also a call to reimagine what it means to be a human being. That's the perennial question that Homer asks himself with Odysseus too. Should he remain on an island with a goddess, forever young and ageless, never dying? Or should he go back to his home with his wife and his son? He chooses mortality every time. So here we sit in the technological age, wrestling with the same questions, seeking to overcome nature, to overcome death. Madeline Miller's Circe gives us an answer, that immortality is death, and that our scars and the stories that we tell draw us together to live more richly. Madeline Miller and Circe seem to be urging us not to give up on death, because if we do, we're giving up on life. I'll stop there. Thank you. See if you have any questions.
Well, Well, thank you, Dr. Maiullo, for that great introduction to Greek mythology and Circe. We will now open up the floor to questions and comments. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and someone from our Big Read team will come around with a mic. Feel free to ask questions about Dr. Maiullo's lecture, about Circe, and about Greek mythology.
Well, I have a question for you. Who is your favorite Greek god?
My favorite Greek god is Hermes, because he's the trickster god and he has the funniest myths about him. Do you know the one about how when Hermes was a baby, he stole Apollo's cows, and he made the cows walk backwards, and he tried to wipe away all the tracks so Apollo couldn't find him, and every time Apollo went up to him and said, Hermes, I know you stole my cows, and Hermes would say, what are you talking about? I'm a baby. I can't steal cows. I'm just a baby. And that's how the myth goes, and it's hilarious. So the Homeric hymn to Hermes is a recommendation that I would have for you if you want to hear that story. Catherine, your hand is up.
Forgive me if you said this earlier in the lecture, but how do myths start?
We don't know. That's the point of a myth. We don't know where they come from. Usually some people will say, like, hey, I try to suggest that when we're talking about Daedalus, right, that there are these remains in Knossos that kind of look like a maze, and then somebody comes up with a cool story about how that might have gotten there. So that's one way that myths might start, but the start of the myth is less interesting than the present of the myth. Why are we telling it now still?
What made you want to study Greek mythology?
I think I would say that they felt important to me. I don't know that I could articulate at the time why. I think they were just good stories. But as I've gotten older, I've started to see why they might be of value. Yeah, question over here.
At the time that they weren't new, but not as old as they are now, did people really believe them? And if they did, how did that play out in the culture? Like, was it a belief system that created cultural things that we still see today?
Yeah, I mean, people did the Greeks believe their myths? Yes, they did. And in fact, they would invent myths. Certain cities would invent myths in order to make themselves seem more important. So let me give you an example of that. So the great Greek hero, his name is Heracles, and every single Greek city had some connection, like Heracles visited here. You should come check this out because, okay? And so you can go around to just about every Greek city and find their connection to Heracles. They built temples and they built monuments, and all of those things were present and around. Yeah. And here's the other interesting thing about Greek temples. So for the Greeks, it wasn't the temple that was sacred, it was the spot that the temple was built on that was sacred. So if you go to Greece today and you see where a modern church is, they are often built on the site of old temples. Again, because the space is sacred, even if the god who occupies that space can change. So Greek mythology and all those stories about heroes and gods, they still mark the landscape now, even though the spaces are Christian and not pagan. So that's just one example. I can hear you, but maybe others can't hear you, so.
Two questions.
Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
one is just a comment. Are you familiar with Brian Dory's The Theater of War Project?
No.
Wow. You and he are doing the same thing.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
It's amazing. He takes the old Greek myths and performs them on, and then, well, I'll tell you.
Okay.
The other question is, what do you do with the relationship between Penelope and Circe?
At the end of the novel, you mean?
Yeah, but yeah. That
So for
I was really worried about Penelope being there. I thought that was going to be the end of.
So Penelope needs her own story too, because in the Odyssey, she just waits for Odysseus to come home. Now, the thing about Penelope in the Odyssey, though, is that she is as smart as, if not smarter than her husband. In fact, she tricks him a couple of times. And so I think Madeline Miller wants to give Penelope her own after story. Traditionally, Odysseus doesn't stay on Ithaca. He has to go on other adventures. And there's this poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson called Ulysses. I don't know if you've read it, but basically the point of that poem is Odysseus is home, and he's been home for a little while, and now he's bored, and he wants to go on another adventure. And so he decides that he's going to let Telemachus, his son, take care of Ithaca, and he's going to go off and do his thing. And it's about restlessness, really. So I think what Madeline Miller is trying to do is she's trying to allow Penelope an opportunity to go on her own story, her own adventure, so she's not locked on Ithaca the way that the male poets have her. And so she goes off with Telemachus to Aiaia, and she gets her own island and gets to explore how, because of her cleverness, she gets to explore and take over the place that Circe eventually is going to leave. And so it's very clever what Madeline Miller is up to, I think. And so I get that you would be worried about it, but Madeline Miller wants to give her an adventure to go on, I think. And it's a magnificent one. I don't want to spoil too much in case you haven't read it.
Say more at the end of the novel, contrasting Telemachus and Telegonus. They have different destinies. Telemachus seems to be the originator of Rome, the Roman Empire. He's the warrior, and her son by Odysseus. Telegonus has a different destiny. Say a little bit about the contrast.
Yeah, okay, so in the ancient tradition, there is supposedly there was a poem called the Telegony, which does not survive. We don't have it. All we have of the Telegony is a summary of what happened in that poem. And the summary of what happened in that poem, almost all of it made it into Madeline Miller's novel. She used that summary as fodder for the second half of her novel. And that story essentially is that Telemachus accidentally kills Odysseus, which happens, and Telemachus and Penelope go back to Aiaia, where Telemachus will marry Circe, which is what happens. And Telegonus will go off and found the Etruscans, who are living in Rome, and so he does that. So that's part of the ancient tradition that Madeline Miller is working with. It doesn't get a full story because it doesn't survive, so Miller's taking a crack at it. Yeah. That part of the story is really cool, actually. Wild, but yeah, it's very cool.
What about Madeline Miller's writing style do you favor like the most about it?
I love her turns of phrase. She writes a good sentence. I could just even the ones that I have posted here. I mean, look at this description of Circe looking at Odysseus's scars. I mean, this is just spectacular. It has a good flow and a good rhythm. See, to me, I like to read this stuff out loud, and I love the sounds that it makes and the construction of her sentences. You know, I watch the pain passing over his face. Now it hurt. Now it still hurt. And now. And now. It's actually economical, that sentence. But she says so much with just a few words, just adverbs and conjunctions, really. So it's her writing style that I'm so attracted to, I think, in addition to the story itself. Yes. Yes.
And, you know, the way she goes after Scylla is pretty rough, but then, I don't know, she just seems too mature.
Yes, of course, yes. So we're, you know, there's the first part of the story, you know, she's lonely. She has this experience. She said that a great Madeline Miller line, Circe says, "My throat scraped with loneliness." I know exactly what that feels like, what that throat scraping feels like. It's great. So she's like going out into the water, and she has no friends and no one's talking to her, and she meets this fisherman that she talks to and looks forward to meeting this fisherman every day. And they talk about how, I wish that we could be together. You know, it's very adolescent in a way, you know, we're going to be together. And so she figures out how to turn him into a god. And the minute she does that, he goes after Scylla, this prettier woman, and she is just filled with jealousy and rage. And so she begins to use her witchcraft, and she uses her witchcraft in order to turn her into this horrible monster, right? This very jealous teenager kind of behavior over a scorned lover. And the story goes that, you know, she claims that she's just turning people into who they really are, right? That her witchcraft just turns them into what they really are inside. But by the end of the story, we learn that that's probably not the case, that she's turning them into the things that she sees them as, right? And that realization is an important part of her journey of self-discovery, I think, and growth. Yeah, she's a character that develops along the way.
Steve, one of the hopes we have as a Big Read program is that people use our Big Read Chosen book to then, as a springboard, read other books. And if people are so inspired to go back to the Odyssey, do you have a translation that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I've been quoting from Stanley Lombardo's translation, which I like. It was developed for oral performance some 20 years ago, but it's an old translation now. And there are parts of it that are not accurate. A more recent translation, I think it was done in 2019, after Circe was published, I believe, is by Emily Wilson. It's also a very excellent translation, and so I'm beginning to recommend that one. The last time I taught the Odyssey was last summer, and my students said to me, "I think it's time that we read Emily Wilson's translation," and they're not wrong. Her translation's very good, so I recommend anyone who's trying to read the Odyssey. Those are the two translations I would recommend most.
Thank you for all of your engaging questions, and we hope you will attend more events. Just to highlight a few of these events, on Thursday, George O'Connor is going to be speaking on Greek mythology and graphic novels. Next week, on the 7th, Joe Goodkin will be giving a musical performance of the Odyssey. And on the 9th, Matt De La Pena will be talking about Last Stop on Market Street. Roosevelt Montez is coming to Hope November 10th to talk about his book, Rescuing Socrates. And finally, on the 14th, Madeline Miller will be speaking on Greek mythology and her book, Circe. Also, if you want to hear more from Dr. Maiullo, you can listen to Behind the Read podcast Season 3, which just came out today. Thank you again for coming tonight, and we hope to see you again.